Here's a table of 5 students and 3 classes for each of those students in periods 0, 1, and 2. Remember, in computer science, we start counting with 0. So there are the classes for student 0, math, Spanish, and government. For student 1, cooking, weight training, and history. Student 2, engineering, personal finance, and cookie baking. Student 3, computer science, band, and chemistry. And student 4, art, psychology, and literature. Each of the 5 students has 3 classes in periods 0, 1, and 2. So we actually have groups of students and groups of classes in rows and columns. Each row is a student. Each column is a class period. So in row 3, column 1, we find band. That's for the 3rd student, which is actually in the 4th spot, in column 1, which of course is really the 2nd column. So where in the array would you find history? It's in the 1, 2 spot. We're going to use 2-dimensional arrays to mimic this row and column look that you would find in a table. So I'll make a project about arrays in 2 dimensions. And I'll call the class 2-dimensional array. And we'll see how this mimics rows and columns. We'll notice that 2-dimensional arrays are actually arrays of arrays. We're going to need a scanner object because we're going to, at some point later in this program, get user input. It won't happen right away in this video. As I said, a 2-dimensional array is actually an array of arrays. In this example, there's an array of 5 students, and within each student, there's an array of 3 class periods. So we'll create a 2-dimensional array, and the idea is that the rows will represent each student, and the columns will represent each class period. So this array is about student schedules. So I'll say string, and then I will use 2 brackets, 2 sets of brackets, to indicate that it's a 2-dimensional array. I'll call it schedules. I'll start with a left brace and a right brace, but remember, a 2-dimensional array is an array of arrays. So we'll have braces inside these braces. So here comes another brace to start the first row. Math, Spanish, and government, that's for student 0. So I'll put inside this set of braces math, Spanish, and government, and then I'll end that brace to end the first row. And I'll use a comma. Now we're ready for the next row, so I'll start with another brace. We'll have cooking, weight training, and history, and an ending brace because that ends that row. Another comma and start the next row, which is actually row 2. Remember, we had 0, 1, and 2. This student has engineering, personal finance, and cookie baking. That's the end of this row, so here comes another brace, followed by a comma. Our next student, computer science, band, chemistry. Then an ending brace, because it's the end of that row. Another comma, we have one more row to go. Art, psychology, and literature. That's the last row. So this brace ends that row, and our outside brace ends the entire array of arrays. That's the end of the 2-dimensional array. So you can see here from all the braces that a 2-dimensional array is an array of arrays. Well, let's see if we can get these schedules to print off. It's going to require a nested loop. we have to loop through all the rows, and within each row, loop through all the columns. So I'll start with a for loop for the rows. I'll use int row equals 0. Right now I'll say that row is less than 5 because I have 5 students. And we'll increment row, so row plus plus. And a reminder to ourselves, this for loop is for the rows. That's what this outer loop will do. It will loop through every student from row 0 to row 4. Then, for each student, we needed to loop through all of their class periods. Every one of them has 3 classes. So here comes the nested loop inside. For int col, short for column, equals 0. And I know right now that there are 3 of them, so I'll have column less than 3. And then increment column with col plus plus. And this will loop us through all the class periods, one student at a time. And we'll simply print what the value of each element inside schedules is going to be. So we'll print off, I'll use a tab character here, you'll see why a little later. Schedules, the name of our two-dimensional array. We'll put the row in the first bracket and the column in the second bracket. And there are all the classes in order. Math, Spanish, Government, Cooking, Weight Training, History, Engineering, Personal Finance, Cookie Baking. Those are all the schedules of 3 classes for each of the first 3 students. Well, let's neaten this up by indicating when we have a new student. And that happens in the outer loop where we're counting the rows every time we're at the top of that loop. So we'll print off that this is on a new line, student, and then we'll use the value of row because it will be student 0, student 1, student 2, etc. And we'll indicate that it's this student's schedule. That should make this a little easier to read. And it does. The print off of the student schedule indicator only executes when at the top of the loop about rows. What if we want to change one of the classes? Maybe at 4.2, switch that to aviation. Well, we can assign that. So, the identifier for our array is schedules. And if we want to change the schedule, it's for student 4 at class period 2, then we'll go with schedules, and in the first bracket 4, and in the second bracket 2. And then make it equal what our new class is going to be, which is aviation. And you can see that's what happened. Student 4's schedule has been changed. Let's look at how we can discover the lengths for two-dimensional arrays. We have 2 of them to consider. How many rows there are and how many columns there are. Let's first address the rows, which for our two-dimensional array is the number of students. So we'll give a little prompt here that the number of students, because this is all in the rows, then this is simply going to be schedules.length. There are 5 rows. That's the length of what is in the first bracket. So schedules.length is going to be 5. That's what we got. And there are 5 rows, or 5 arrays inside the array. And each one of those arrays has another length, and that's the length of the columns. Remember, the columns indicate the periods that the students have their classes, periods 0, 1, and 2. So to find the number of columns that we have, we'll recognize that in this two-dimension array, all the rows have the same length. So we just have to pick one of them, it doesn't matter which one, and get the length of that row. I'll go with student 0. But notice all of them have the same length for each row. It is possible to have jagged arrays where they're not all the same length. So since it doesn't really matter which one I'll pick 0 and put that in a bracket. And so we're finding the actual length of the row 0, which happens to be the same length of any of the rows. They all have a length of 3. And there we go. The number of class periods is 3. We'll neaten this up. And that's the number of columns. You can take this knowledge and apply it back to lines 35 and 37. We use some actual numbers to indicate how many times the loops should go. For instance, I had row less than 5 in line 35. But it would be better to say row is less than schedules.length. You can go ahead and make that change. As well as in line 37, where we had the columns less than 3. A better way to attack that is to make the columns less than schedules0.length.